The process of deterioration in dementia is so slow that it's very hard to see without careful measurement in the process. Normally, we do that with what is called the mental status exam, which is a combination of close observation of the person's behavior and some questions that assess how clear their thinking is. For example, as the dementia gets worse, people don't dress appropriately. They don't button their shirts properly. They don't comb their hair. Their mood changes and sometimes becomes quite dramatic in its fluctuations. They may have difficulty forming words, and they will slur the words. And in fact, they may have difficulty just walking. These are all things you can observe. And anyone who works with individuals who have dementia is usually very good at observing these. You also want to know something about their thought processes associated with symptoms like psychoses. So, for example, are they delusional? You need to talk with them and find out what they think about various things to be able to determine that. You need to ask them what they're noticing around them to see if there are perceptual disturbances. There are also a variety of mental functioning that can be assessed with very simple questions that will give you an idea of whether the person's mental capacity is being reduced. For example, in later stages of dementia and during periods of severe delirium, you may not know who you are, or where you are, or what day it is, or what time of day. That's called orientation. You may have a great deal of difficulty paying attention and repeating back things that you heard just seconds earlier. You may have difficulty with the most basic computations. Normally a single question, how much is 3 times 17, will give you an idea of whether they can handle numbers in a reasonable way. By the way, 3 times 17, the answer is 51, might be too difficult for some people, so you might ask, how much is 3 times 5? Almost everyone can give an answer to that unless they have severe intellectual dysfunction prior to the onset of the dementia. Again, you can have someone with a PhD in mathematics who can't tell you how much 3 times 17 is because their brain is no longer functioning. Ask them who the President of the United States is. If they say Barack Obama, okay, they're close, they're within 3 years. If they say Albert Einstein, well, they're really off. If they say Ronald Reagan, well, they're off by a few decades. Those may sound like silly examples, but they're actually fairly common in dementia. In latter stages of dementia, people are so confused that they have no idea what's going on around them. Earlier, you will start to see deterioration in other things like abstract thinking and reasoning. So you might ask them, for example, in what way are an apple and an orange alike? Now the best answer is fruit. A reasonable answer is they're both food, or you can eat both. A wrong answer is they're both round, because obviously a banana is not round. Proverbs represent a way of doing abstract thinking. So you might ask the patient, what does this saying mean? Let sleeping dogs lie. A concrete answer, which is typical of someone with very low IQ or someone in the moderate to later stages of dementia, is don't wake up a dog because if you do, it might bite you. Okay, that's a concrete answer. It's not recognizing that this is a statement that has a broader and less obvious meaning. Asking people what they want to do and why they want to do it will help you to understand their judgment, That is, do they do reasonable behaviors? Or their level of insight? Do they understand that what they're describing are symptoms rather than the reality of what's going on? I'm going to give you an example. My father died of Alzheimer's. And I can tell you quite frankly, it was terrible to watch. It was particularly hard for me because I, at the time, lived 1,000 miles away. So I would only see him every few months, and there would be massive deterioration in that time. I've always called it slow motion death because the person dies before their heart stops beating. As a person knows less and less about their life, as the personality of the individual gradually goes away, as their behavior becomes less and less sophisticated, when they reach a point that they don't know who you are, a point where they don't even know who they are, at one level, they really are dead, or at least a good part of them are dead. At any rate, I wanted to use my father as an example. He, during the dementia, would often want to go home, except his symptoms were such that there was no way that he could go home. There was no way he could be cared for. And on top of it, he was diabetic, and he had already lost one leg due to the diabetes being out of control. He was blind, and yet he wanted to figure out a way to run away with just one leg and drive himself home so that the people in the nursing home wouldn't realize that he had left. Now that's not very good insight into his situation. With one leg, he would have had a terrible time driving. He certainly couldn't run away. If he had left, they certainly would have noticed that in the nursing home. And he can't drive a car. He didn't even have a car there because he was blind. He couldn't see to drive a car. But he didn't know any of those things. At that point, the dementia was so severe that he had no awareness of what's going on. In theory, at least, all of us, if we live long enough, will experience dementia because our brain cells are dying. And we see signs of that as we get older. Our memory isn't as good in our 40s as it was in our 20s. When you get to be my age, it's not nearly as good as you would like. I sometimes have word finding difficulties, which is part of that. That's all normal. But mostly, I'm able to function at a fairly high level despite the fact that I've lost a lot of brain tissue over a 70-year period. But at some point, I will lose so much brain tissue, if I live that long, that I will experience what is called senile dementia. It's a natural process. But some people experience the dementia more rapidly or earlier in life, and we call that a presenile dementia. Alzheimer's, for example, is a presenile dementia. It is a disorder, a disease that speeds up the rate of cell death in our brain. And gradually we see the same deficits we see as we get older, but instead of them happening over a decade, they may happen over a few months, sometimes even a few weeks. Alzheimer's is the most common presenile dementia. Vascular dementia is the next most common. There are a variety of other diseases that can cause this process. Fortunately, most of those are rare. Let's focus on Alzheimer's since, one, it's very common, and two, it's becoming a more significant issue with time. First of all, Alzheimer's is rarely a disorder that we see in younger people. And when we do see it before the age of 60, there tends to be a fairly strong genetic component. Now, there's one exception to that. We talked about it earlier. If you have 3 copies of chromosome 21, you are said to have Down syndrome. And if you have Down syndrome, what will happen is you will start to develop a rapidly progressing Alzheimer's disease at about the age of 40. And the reason is that chromosome 21 has the gene that codes for the beta-amyloid proteins that are part of Alzheimer's. That's pretty good evidence that our identification of that protein as relevant in Alzheimer's is indeed correct. But as you get older, your risk for Alzheimer's increases rather dramatically. So at age 65, retirement age for most people, the risk is only about 1 in 100. But 20 years later, the risk is about 1 in 8. And 30 years later, the risk is approaching 1 in 2. Now, we don't have many people who live past 95, so we don't have real good risk numbers beyond that, but we know it keeps increasing. So why is it increasing right now in frequency? 2 reasons. There's a large group of people that I'm a part of. We're called the baby boom generation. Most people in that generation are right now around 65, sometimes all the way to 75 or 55, but they're quickly moving into the ages in which the risk for Alzheimer's is much higher. Second, we've got better health. Better health care. People live longer. The longer they live, the more they are exposed to Alzheimer's. When most people died before the age of 70, we didn't see a whole lot of Alzheimer's. But 70 is not very old anymore. Many people live well beyond 70. That's going to have implications for you folks in that there's going to be more and more demand on the medical system and on the nursing home care system or nursing care system because of the increase in the number of people with Alzheimer's. Now, what causes Alzheimer's? Well, we're not entirely sure, but what we do know is that there are 2 processes that have been clearly recognized that we can see in an autopsy brain very clearly in people who have Alzheimer's. One are called neurofibrillary tangles. They are proteins. Proteins are long strings of amino acids that fold in a particular way to function chemically within the body. DNA is the template for those proteins. Neurofibrillary tangles are proteins that didn't fold properly. Because they didn't fold properly, they don't work properly. And so the cell doesn't work, and the cell then dies. There are also disc-like, almost shiny discs that are made out of a beta-amyloid protein that are not inside the cells, but outside of the neurons. We're not entirely sure if that's part of the causal chain or might be a result or something that's entirely unrelated. But we do know that in individuals who have Alzheimer's, when we look at the brain at autopsy, it's very easy to see these discs. Those are called senile plaques. Both of these tend to cluster only in certain parts of the brain. Primarily the cerebral cortex, the entire area that covers most of the brain. That's where we do most of our thinking and most of our perception. And the hippocampus. That's where we do most of our long-term memory, where we produce those long-term memories that are stored, spread out in the cerebral cortex. That's probably why memory loss is one of the first things. And it's memory loss not for things we learned 30 years ago. It's memory loss for things we learned 30 minutes ago. We're not processing new memories very well. One of the interesting things about this is if it were more spread out in the brain, it would probably be a more rapid terminal illness. Because if the damage was done to, say, the brain stem, the structures in the brain stem are critical to survival. That's what keeps our heart beating and us breathing. So if that part of the brain was damaged, we probably would die at a much earlier age. As I mentioned, genes seem to play a role, but only for early onset, that is before the age of 60. So if you have a family member who died of Alzheimer's or has Alzheimer's, my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's at the age of 75. My genetic risk is probably not elevated because that's not an early onset, that's a later onset. And that probably has very little in the way of genes that contribute. Estrogen has a protective factor. Now, we've seen this before. Estrogen had a protective factor with schizophrenia. It wasn't enough to have fewer women with schizophrenia than men, but it was enough that women on average tended to develop schizophrenia about 5 years later than men. What estrogen does here is it seems to slow the process. Doesn't stop it, it seems to slow the process. A particularly interesting finding is that those people who are mentally active tend to experience the onset of Alzheimer's as a slower process. We often refer to that as a use it or lose it phenomenon. We now know that mental activity is certainly relevant here, but physical activity seems to be relevant as well. So people that are physically active also seem to have a slightly slower process, which may not necessarily be good if they live a long time because you will see it develop and it's really painful to watch. And as I mentioned, Down syndrome, unfortunately, it's very rare to see anyone there who lives past 50, simply because Alzheimer's will take them before that. As I mentioned, at one time, they rarely made it to age 5 because of heart problems. And they rarely then, once we learned to deal with the heart problems, made it past 20. Now, unfortunately, when they get to the stage that includes Alzheimer's, there isn't anything yet that we can do to stop that. Now, there are other causes besides Alzheimer's. I'm going to cover them very briefly. Serious head injuries can cause dementia, but it will be stable because you do damage to the brain, but it's not a disease process that continues to do damage. You can see some dementia from a major stroke, but more often than not, it isn't a major stroke, but what we call vascular dementia. In vascular dementia, you don't have a big stroke, but you have thousands of little ones all the time. So brain cells all over your brain are dying off because the blood supply is being deprived, either because the blood vessels are being blocked, so no blood can get through, or they're breaking, and so there is no longer a pathway to get blood there. There are a variety of disease processes. Most of these are very rare. I'm not going to talk about many of them, but I'll mention a couple. Pick's disease seems to be a process similar to Alzheimer's, except it's almost exclusively in the frontal lobes. So what happens is the person becomes increasingly less able to do anything complex because they can't seem to remember the steps that are involved. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Try saying that 3 times fast. You know it by another name. It's called mad cow disease. If you had a hamburger earlier today or planning on having one, you may not know this, but it is possible for someone to be able to tell you what cow that hamburger came from. Not only that, they can tell you what cow that particular cow was next to at almost any time in their life. So if they were part of a herd in, say, Nebraska, they will know that herd, all of the individual cows there. The reason for it is mad cow disease has a very long incubation period, roughly 15 years. So when a cow is found to have mad cow disease, they immediately kill the cow and burn it and bury it. But they also kill every cow that cow has been in contact with and burn and bury them to prevent the spread of mad cow disease. Huntington's disease is a result of a single dominant gene. Typically, you don't see any symptoms until about the age of 40. You start out seeing symptoms that involve jerky movements, but very quickly you get dementia, and in most cases the person by age 45 has died. Like Alzheimer's, it's a terrible thing to watch. I had a good friend who died of it. Her marriage broke up because I think her husband was terrified that he would see her go through what he saw her mother go through. Now we can identify that gene. Now we will be able to tell people that they're carriers. If you have that gene and you have children, on average, half of your children will get the gene. And all of the people that get the gene will die of this disease. And again, it's like a sped up Alzheimer's disease with some other symptoms that are present. But for decades, we knew what it was. And we knew that it was genetic, but we couldn't identify the gene. And most people have their children before the age of 40. So by the time you find out you have Huntington's disease, and let's say you have 4 children, on average you will know that 2 of those 4 children also carry the gene, and it will kill them before the age of 45. And if they have any children, half of their children will also have the disease. Now that we can identify it, you know if you're a carrier, so you can make a reasoned decision about whether you will have children. Most people who know they're a carrier decide not to have children. Hopefully that will result in this gene dying out very quickly, and so it'll be a thing of the past. Again, this is a terrible disease to watch. I actually, when I was in graduate school, did some work at a psychiatric hospital run by the VA in western Wisconsin. There's, for reasons we don't fully understand, a very large contingent of individuals with Huntington's disease in the Midwest, and most of them were treated at this hospital. So I saw a lot of patients at various stages. And again, dementia is not a pretty thing to watch. Can we treat dementia? Not really. If we suspect vascular dementia, controlling the blood pressure will probably reduce the number of strokes, will slow it down. There are medications that look like they slow down the process in Alzheimer's. That's why we now have the diagnosis of mild neurocognitive disorder. The idea is if we can detect this earlier and slow it down for several years, it'll never get to the stages that we see in many patients now. For a while, the person can live at home. They may be confused. They should not get in a car because they'll forget where they're going and not be able to pay attention well enough to be a reasonable driver. But at some point, they're not going to be able to live at home. My father-in-law also had Alzheimer's, and at the time I was writing textbooks in my home, So when his dementia got to the point that he couldn't safely live by himself, he came to live with us. I had an office in the basement, and I could hear him move around. He would watch TV and, do whatever. His dog was with him. He'd play with the dog. But one of the things I discovered is that he would forget where the bathroom was. Now, the bathroom was not hidden. And in fact, when we discovered that he forgot it, we put some signs up to point him in the right direction. But that wasn't apparently enough. If I would hear him start pacing around, I would listen carefully, because if he started pacing too quickly, it usually meant that he was desperate to go to the bathroom and he couldn't find the bathroom. So I'd go upstairs, and rather than tell him where the bathroom was, I would go to the bathroom and leave the door open so he could see what was going on. Then he'd walk in right after me. Now, again, he was still able to eat. He was able to dress himself, reasonable grooming, but he couldn't find the bathroom that was in plain view. When he came to move in with us, the first week he was there, he walked outside and walked away and got completely lost 5 doors from our house, less than half a block. We were able to find him, but we realized that that's kind of scary, because, we might very well have had him get lost to the point where we couldn't find him. So we installed double cylinder locks. You had to have a key for every door that went outside except one, which went into the backyard. The backyard was fenced, and we had a lock on the fence. So he could go outside anytime he wanted. He could sit on the back deck, but he couldn't walk away from the home. And I don't think he had at that point any idea that the other doors were not available to him. Except later in the summer, he went outside and he couldn't find the door to get in. Now, the backyard wasn't that big. It was impossible to miss the door, but he couldn't get back in. So we ended up putting a double cylinder lock on the last door, because had he done it in the winter, had I not been paying attention and realized it was too quiet, thought he was just sitting in front of the TV and watching, he might well have frozen to death had he not taken a jacket with him when he went outside. That's an example of how you can go from being able to stay at home, but gradually get to the point where, unless someone can watch 24/7, it's just too dangerous to keep the person at home. So at some point, if they live long enough through this dementia process, they will probably require a nursing home, where someone can be watching them 24/7, where if they walk out the door, there's an alarm that goes off, and immediately the staff on duty knows that someone went outside, where there are cameras that can follow people and allow you to very quickly identify them once they leave the facilities. Can we prevent Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia? I'd like to say yes, but the things that we know that reduce the risk have relatively small effects. Certainly, controlling blood pressure is very important with vascular dementia. No evidence that that helps with Alzheimer's. Smoking is not good for you in lots of ways, but it seems like smoking may make dementia more likely to occur as well, perhaps because you are depriving your brain cells of the oxygen that they need. Being physically and socially active seems to be helpful. That's a good thing to do, simply because it makes life more worthwhile as you age to stay active. There is some exciting research going on, but it's not far enough along that I will even take time to share it with you. My sincere hope is that by the time each of you reach the point of retirement, that the scourge of Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia will be significantly reduced. So this chapter covered neurocognitive disorders, that is, difficulty in thinking and perceiving that is a result of some deficit in the functioning of the brain. Delirium is dramatic, rapid onset, usually indicates some severe problem, but typically one that can be reversed in most cases with proper medical attention. Dementia, in contrast, is very slow onset. One barely notices it. And what happens is after the diagnosis is finally made, you often realize there have been symptoms for quite a while. Almost all dementias are the result of a disease process, so they're progressive and eventually will be terminal. There are non-progressive dementias that may be caused by massive head injuries, where there's no disease process that makes the neurological decline continue over time.